Okay, so an introduction to visual literacy. Well, the definition of visual literacy is the ability to interpret, use, appreciate, and create images and video using both conventional and 21st century media in ways that advance thinking, decision-making, communication, and learning. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get our students to become visually literate so they can understand these messages, these images that are bombarding them on a daily basis through media and in the classroom. So why is visual literacy important? The great George Lucas once said, if people aren't taught the language of sound and images, shouldn't they be considered as illiterate as if they left college without being able to read or write? We're a very media-based society, through television, through radio. So it's hard to escape images and imagery that's hitting us throughout the day. I think that's probably what Lucas is trying to associate that with, so we can't follow blindly as sheep when it comes to media. So why should we bother teaching our students visual literacy? Well, visualization tools enable students to make their thinking visible in all academic areas. Students are able to build interactive models to test theories in real time and use graphics to display results. Graphic organizers and visual mapping tools enable students to make sense of complex subjects by exploring linkages, relationships, similarities, and differences between phenomena, and visually representing interplay among system components. Visual representations in general can serve a variety of functions. They can do things like try to capture attention, so the ability of a visualization to attract, direct, or keep the attention of the participants. So when we're building things instructionally, or even writing on the whiteboard, what we're trying to do by using perhaps different colors or different formats on a smartboard would be to try to gain the attention of our students. Recall is the ability of a visualization to convey content in a memorable way. So the way we organize it, the way we package it visually, so students can remember it. Overview is the ability of a visualization to synthesize detail and provide a macro structure of what organizes many elements into a coherent whole. So how do we unify something? How do we show it's part of a whole? Comprehension, the ability of a visualization to foster understanding, learning, and sense-making activities by showing relationships. So how do we show the relationships between branches of government, for instance, visually? Discovery, the potential of a visualization to trigger new insights for its users, participants, by highlighting meaningful, interesting patterns. I'll show you one of those in a minute, because I actually have a visualization of that. Emotion, the ability of a visualization to trigger functional emotional response to it. Coordination is the ability of a visualization to guide a group of people and provide common points of reference, for instance, maps. Well, the educational implications of this are that we have this wonderful internet-based society now. So we have this World Wide Web with the convergence of voice, video, and data into a common digital format. And students are high-end users of these things. So we have this increased level of visual imagery that's constantly bombarding our students. I like to call it on-demand education, because if the student goes home and wants to figure something out or wants to learn something that's of their interest, they can quickly pull it up in many different formats. They can have a podcast that's streaming. They can pull up something on YouTube or TeacherTube, see a demonstration of something or simulation. Or they can go with traditional text-based, but a different variety of writing styles in different languages, honestly. So if English isn't their first language, they can maybe understand astrophysics a little bit better, perhaps in Portuguese or in Spanish. So the problem is we have a gap here between what they're seeing at school and what they can have on demand at home. If education is very static at school, in which the teacher's there lecturing at the board and bombarding the student with voice and voice and voice and copy this board and copy that board, the flexibility of at-home online on-demand education for them to actually figure out what they need to figure out is going to be much more enriching in that environment and make your classroom much more static. So that's why we need more technology in the classroom to compete with students' on-demand level of education at home. Students who are visually literate have a working knowledge of visuals produced or displayed through electronic media. So they understand basic elements of visual design, technique, and media. They're aware of emotional, psychological, and physiological and cognitive influences in perceptions of visuals. So if you ever crack open a magazine like Vogue or like GQ or Esquire, you'll see that there's a lot of ads. Almost half of the magazine content is advertisement, meant to provoke something psychologically or provoke something physiologically, to influence particularly children and young people that are going to be up-and-coming buyers, consumers, to go out and spend their money because they need to look like that girl or they need to look like this boy. So that's something that we need to socialize our children to being understanding about through the media, so they're rational about what they're being exposed to visually. It's important that they comprehend representational, explanatory, abstract, and symbolic images. So, if we take a look at a couple of magazine covers, it's quite obvious here that that we have a certain perception of the female body and what children should be viewing as they think the female body should look like this, when it's not true. Bodies come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and colors, and that's a good thing. Diversity is a very good thing. So if we look at a couple of things here, so if we look at the Vogue issue on the left, it's actually Vogue in India. It's India Vogue. So you have to really wonder why the Caucasian girl in the middle is there when the focus really is the first issue of Vogue in India. It's easily because we're trying to anglify the entire world through our media, which again is not an appropriate thing to do. But when children are exposed to this in the classroom, they start to think, well, I need to look like that blonde girl. Diversity is not a good thing when it should be embraced. So students who are visually literate apply knowledge of visuals in electronic media. So they become informed viewers, critics, and consumers of visual information. They can critique it. They can actually make that bridge that I just made by looking at that cover. They're knowledgeable designers, composers, and producers of visual information, so they can produce and get their message across visually. They're effective visual communicators. They're expressive, innovative visual thinkers and successful problem solvers. So I'm going to talk to you about seven different visualization types. I'm going to give you examples of the visualization types that we can look at here. The first one is sketches. Then we have diagrams, images, maps, objects, interactive visualizations, and stories. And I'll show you each of those. Okay, so the sketch is something that's quickly done. It's something that's spur of the moment usually. So anytime you pick up the pen to write on the whiteboard or the chalkboard, or the smartboard in your classroom, you're probably sketching something out, so the students get more meaning to something that you're trying to give them. You're trying to make them understand. Again, it's very quick. It could be representative of individuals' political sketches, for instance, or it can be something that that shows a link between A and B. For instance, directions on a napkin can also be construed as a sketch. Diagrams are logical. They show a flow. They show a linkage. Sometimes show cause and effect. So when you want your students to see a relationship between items, you probably diagram it out. Image is something that is supposed to provoke useful emotion. Obviously, this image provokes, a very strong emotion of nausea. Common reactions are the word ew or yuck or ouch that are probably provoked. But it's funny how we can pair images with words, and we can say, we can change the response altogether. For instance, if we paired this image with the words, well, that really hit the nail on the head, it becomes something comical. It becomes satirical at that point, and changes the meaning altogether. Maps, they usually show a micro level within something macro, so something small like roads within a city, something large. They can be to scale, they can be not to scale. For instance, this is the London subway system, and you can see that things are color-coded out, they have a legend, etc. And it's different phases of the planned subway project for the London Tube. So let's go back to that one for a second. Usually they have a purpose, though. They have a purpose of moving people from one place to another. That's the logic, that's the reason behind them, that's why they exist. So always remember that. Interactive visualizations, well, it's easy. If you're inputting something and you're making it manipulate and change into something else, then that becomes interactive visualization. Anytime you use your computer system, then you have an interactive visualization because you're inputting data by clicking on a mouse, putting in data through the keyboard, and then it changes. It refreshes to be something else. Well, objects are three-dimensional. They take up space, right? Little bit different than the two-dimensional material that we've talked about, in the fact that you can probably reach out and touch them. Objects usually are placed in a space to create flow and movement of people as well. So, for instance, if you've ever been to a museum, a larger museum like the Smithsonian, you'll see things like the big dinosaurs, the big skeletons, placed in strategic places to help the flow of people and movement from one place to another. So you'll see we actually move quite like cattle being driven throughout a museum based on the different ways that the exhibits have been set up properly. So we tend to migrate to that which is three-dimensional rather than two-dimensional, and we migrate from those larger objects from one to another as we work our way through a setting. Stories can be something more abstract. So obviously we don't have this in reality, this glossy background, this glossy plane in which we have giant writing on it and women sitting on park benches. These can be used to provoke a response in students, to try to find meaning, to try to problem solve by exposing them to something like this. We also have things like, well, let's talk about that for a second. So now that I've just finished up those 7 types, you might want to take a look at my PowerPoint presentation on this too, because there's a written description of each of those different images that you've just seen and what they represent within society in general. So you probably want to look at those before you take the visual literacy quiz. Examples of instructional images can be several. I'm just going to deal with a few. So we'll deal with things like decorative visuals, representative visuals, organizational visuals, interpretive visuals, and transformative visuals. Okay, so decorative visuals in the classroom. They're used to make instruction more appealing and motivating. They typically do not have a strong association with the instructional content. Alright, so we have to be careful though, because you notice the image that I've put on here is that of a arrow pointing to the left. So it makes no sense. It's really not much meaning there. It's just basically for decoration, as is the bar over on the left with the puzzle pieces. The only problem is the message that we're giving, because we have, kind of a logic system built into us. We've habituated to the idea that, well, if we see an arrow pointing in a direction, we usually follow that in terms of line of sight. So if I see an arrow there, I'm probably going to look left, and then I might get, if I'm a student perhaps with an attention issue, I might start to get lost in the puzzle pieces rather than paying attention to the content, trying to figure out which is the next piece of the puzzle that needs to go together. So be aware of what you're doing in terms of images that are associated with other things. Representative visuals, they're used to make information more concrete. They're used to convey information quickly and easily in the classroom. So I couldn't think of a better representative visual than perhaps this this mixing of colors that shows how colors are mixed together to form other colors, because it shows exactly what it is. You mix these colors together, they become this. Organizational visuals help learners understand the structure, sequence, and hierarchy of information and help integrate that information. Charts, graphs, and other items that help people see relationships between elements are considered organizational visuals. So for instance, if we look at this item here, this is the mapping of the relationship between different branches of government in the United States. So it's a huge hierarchy, but again, you see how branches relate to each other and how they communicate with each other. So in doing that, we're looking at how the system is organized, and hopefully students can remember something like this compared to a written text version describing how each of these relate to each other. Interpretive visuals help learners understand difficult and ambiguous content. In general, they make information more comprehensible. Examples include models of systems and diagrams of processes. Okay, so in terms of interpretive visuals, if we look at this, when we learn to count, we do things like count things on our fingers. So that's a little limiting because we're limited to 10, and then we spread out to our toes and start counting those too. Here, on this handout, this instructional handout, you see that what we're trying to do is show students meaning of symbol systems, and the symbol system is 1, 2, 3, 4. So the symbol system that we've built around numbers. So we see that the 2 red dots equals 2, the 4 blue dots equals that symbol 4, and we're trying to bridge that logic so students understand that, okay, the 2 means those 2 fingers or those 2 dots. So at that point it becomes interpretive, because we're interpreting for the students what that symbol means. It means 2 units, or it means 4 units of something. If we look at transformative visuals, they make information more memorable. So a transformative visual focuses more on helping the learner understand than on presenting the content. Transformative visuals affect long-term memory because they rely on analogy or previous experiences stored in memory as devices to help people learn. So we can look at something like this. This is what's known as touch math. So it's a logic system for students in which they start to be coded into memory, where they start to code in a number system into memory. So the black dots obviously represent 1 unit. The red dots with the black centers, they represent 2 units when counting. So as we present these to students, this type of logic system to students over and over and over and over again, they start to visualize the dots being on the characters even though they're no longer present. So after we've exposed the students to this type of coding for, say, 3 months, 4 months, if we start to phase it out and take it away, they're going to be representative. They're going to see those numbers as being as having those dots built into them, even though they're not present on the page in the handout that we're giving them. This type of mathematics activity, this type of coding, has shown that students can do mathematics and addition, rudimentary mathematics like addition and subtraction, much earlier than their classroom peers that aren't exposed to a coding system like this visually. Okay, so that's the introduction to visual literacy. Now I'm going to show you some good and some bad and some ugly examples of visual literacy in the classroom. Okay, so if we talk about things like this term, technocentric design, that means that the design of what you're doing visually has been driven technically rather than through functional features, through functionality, through good design for a reason. So we have a term in education, and we're notoriously bad for this, called edujunk. So it's educational junk, because people in the field of education are notorious for overusing clip arts, borders around things, shading, all capitalized text, all centered text, and word art. So I'm going to give you some best practices in which you can get away from doing those overuse items. So just because a feature is existing in a program and you're aware of it doesn't mean you need to use it every time you do something. So I'm going to give you some best practices. I'm going to give you a model of visual communication of which you can use for the rest of the semester. Okay, so the first best practice, color. Well, this is what's known as a color wheel. This allows us to choose colors, to try to make them make sense and work better within our design. We usually use color for things like showing differences or showing similarities. So, when I build something structurally, if we look across the wheel, we can talk about complementary colors. Okay, so we can talk about something that's across being complementary. So, for instance, if I use one of these blues with the shade of orange, it probably is going to fit well together because it's across the wheel. But in doing this, in choosing something vastly different, I probably want to denote something being different within a document. So if I was to do a classroom newsletter, that I'd be using two colors that are very different to show differences in terms of design. Okay, so for instance, differences in terms of a very large level heading, macro level headings, versus more subheadings. If we choose companion colors, which is right beside each other on the color wheel, so anything that's right beside each other is a companion color. If we choose something that's companion, including the shades that you see there within the same slice of pie. So if we choose a companion, we're probably showing a similarity. So underneath one of those subheadings, so if, as the subheading I used, say, one of these lighter blues, and then I use the darker blue as the text body, as the actual text within that paragraph that's being discussed in that newsletter, that would probably make sense because it's similar content. Again, you can get the idea. Color wheels can be even more developed. They can have lots of colors, or they can have very few colors. Again, choosing across, we're talking about complementary. Choosing within the same slice of pie, we're talking about companion. So best practices in terms of layout. The model that I'm going to give you is called the CARP model, C-A-R-P, for contrast, alignment, repetition, and proximity. So if we talk about the first item, contrast, it kind of sets up the same thing that I just talked about. If I'm showing a contrast, I'm showing a difference for a reason. That's why we do things like bold headings within a document and leave the text body at a different level of darkness, of contrast. Okay, so going on to the alignment in the CARP model. So type can be aligned along the lines of a shape. So in this case we can align it along the top and the bottom. We can also align it along the inside of a shape, and because the contrast is fairly decent, this is piggybacking on the last thing we just talked about, because the contrast is good, it's not a problem. The alignment's good and the contrast is decent because I can still read, the readability is still high. We get into a problem when we do things like put the type offset, aligning it in ways that don't make logical sense to the human brain. So when we offset the top from the lower line here, because we read left to right in English language, it seems off, it seems wrong, it seems incongruent, the two items. So it takes us longer to process, and you don't want students in a situation where it's taking them longer to process material in your classroom because they can't figure out things because of your design. So that's one item. The other item of issue here is the fact that we have the black font that's appearing over a gray line. So that shading effect, that could be obscured for some students with visual impairments. So again, we want everything to be accessible to everybody in your classroom. So we want to build things universally so all students can have access to the information. So best practices, here we're talking about repetition. So take a look here. We can repeat several different structures. In this case, we have the rectangles that are repeated. We have the colors that are repeated. We have the lack of color of the font. We have the white that's repeated. We have the upsized first letter on all of them as well. Okay, so don't read this slide yet, but think back to the last slide. Try to recall what was in the last slide. So you remember something was there as the main heading. What was that main heading? Then think about the sub-items. The main heading was sports. So think about the sub-items. What were the different sports that were being played, that were shown within that diagram, within that structure that was repeated? Chances are you'll remember most of those because of the way it was built. I never read those to you. I never stated any of those items, and yet look at the recall that you've done because you took notice of them. Okay, so think about that in your classroom when you show your students material, when you build instructional material. You want them to have that level of recall. You want them to easily recall items out of memory. Best practices in terms of proximity. This is the end of the CARP model, right? P for proximity. So type can be close in proximity to show relationships. So we group similar things together. Type can be far apart to show a difference. So if we look at the first group of text, the first paragraph there over on the left, this sentence and the sentence below it look like they belong together. The sentence looks like it belongs to the sentence above, even though it's in a different typeface. So even though we've used a different typeface for the two different sentences, because their proximity is close, they look like they're one unit, like they belong together. Looking at the other item on the right, typeface that is far apart seems unrelated. Even though this sentence is in the same typeface as the top sentence, it still seems unrelated because of that gapping. So if we look at a few other items within layout relating to CARP model. So, contrast. Students learn better when extraneous material is excluded rather than included in words. In other words, focus on what's important by removing what's not important. Okay, so what's not important in this visual? That's right, it's the frogs. So you might have this fantastic love for frogs. You're a science teacher and you've done research on frogs and just love frogs. But by doing something like this, by including visuals that just don't represent anything to do with the material, you're becoming distracting. You've distracted your students from what's important on this page, which happens to be the message, the content in terms of words. Well, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, what about that visual over on the left now? Well, because it's been used over and over and over again, by now it's become neutral. It reads as neutral on the page because it's something that has just fit in. It also fits in because it goes with the black and white text that's used on the page. So the contrast is very little there compared to our multicolored frogs. Alignment. Okay, so again, going back to memory, research on chunking is indirectly related to alignment because aligning items tends to group items perceptually. So when we put things that make sense in terms of alignment, lining them up, then children can perceive them better, they can process the material better. Thus what might be considered several distinct elements is instead perceived as one element because we put them together alignment-wise. In other words, a new schema may be created by a chunk which becomes the basis for expanding memory or the ability to reduce cognitive load. So by putting similar items together, it allows students to chunk them together in memory and make more sense. Okay, so if we talk about repetition now, and memory, rehearsal is the act of repeating information in memory and significantly increase retention. So if you've ever gone away on vacation for a couple of weeks and come back and suddenly forgot your password for your email or even your PIN number for your ATM card, it's because you never brought that information back into memory during that 2-week time and used it while you're away. So if we don't use it, we lose it in terms of memory. If it doesn't come out and resurface once in a while, it gets forgotten. So using repetition in colors, lines, shapes, depth, and space, again, helps our students create perceptual links or chunks of information to encode them into memory. Proximity. Obviously, students learn better when corresponding words and pictures are represented near rather than far from each other. You probably, on your whiteboard, if you've ever seen a teacher write a bunch of material down on a whiteboard, run out of space, and then decide to draw a diagram that's incongruent far somewhere away from the text that actually is important to that diagram, when students copy down those notes and it's out of order like that, it becomes an issue of proximity. They're going to have a harder time linking up that information later on and processing it and recalling it. So you've done damage by not planning out what should have been planned out in terms of design originally. So I'll give you a couple of examples here, the good, the bad, and the ugly. What I'm going to show you is a classroom newsletter that should give you a very good idea of what bad visual design is, what message we're giving, what good visual design is, and some absurd cases that that just are incongruent with everything. Okay, so it's a good textbook example here. Alright, so we have something called faux materials for faux painting. So the idea of this visual was to show people what materials are used in this painting technique and how to do it. If you're having a hard time reading the script that's been used as a typeset, don't feel bad. because it's very inaccessible. So a few things that are problematic out of this visual communication is, let's deal with the first one. Contrast. Well, we have really no contrast at all here. The only thing that really pops here is our grid that makes no sense whatsoever with the background. No contrast has really been used to show a difference between levels of headings and different material that's going on. Alignment. Well, let's take a look at the first row here. So we have a paint bucket here together with this material. So paint is a primary ingredient, and the most important thing considering when dealing with paint. So these two items are together, but because we put this grid in here, the alignment becomes off because they're not lining up. They're not making sense in terms of alignment. It doesn't look like they're grouped in terms of unity. That's an issue of proximity as well because we put in that line. We also have, in terms of alignment, we go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth in our rows and then rag in the middle. So really we have an alignment issue there as well. For repetition, well, fonts are repeated, but they're repeated badly. Repetition could be an element of, say, a line being repeated, or it could be a color that's being repeated, or the font that's been repeated to show different levels of heading from the text, etc. Repetition, very poor. Everything's the same font, it's just a different size. And we have things that aren't repeated, so we have this kind of word art effect that is surrounding a couple of items and not the rest. Proximity. Again, we don't have things grouped together. They're not chunked together to make sense, so they don't make sense at all on this diagram. So let's take a look at what could possibly be done with this to make it look better. Okay, so what they've done to clean this up, they've put a background little piece here with the faux painting materials in white, so that dark background with the lighter contrast of the font just pops, so we can see exactly what's meant to be said there. Even though we kept the script, it's a more accessible script here in terms of the content. Alignment. Things are aligned, the picture is aligned together with the different paragraphs. Repetition, we have repetition of the bolding of the different headings here. And we have repetition of the font, obviously. Proximity, we've grouped similar items together in terms of words and content into the items. We don't have a separation of the written material. It's all together, and it makes sense. Repetition, we also have this line art here with the little dot at the end that helps show a separation between items. We also have a proximity issue here because we created this gap in between dissimilar items that allows us to show that these are different. Okay, so let's look at another one here for a second. So you've seen the bad, you've seen the good. Let's see if I can find an ugly for you. Okay, so in the ugly, we'll just let that pop open because it's going to open up a web browser for me. And this is a newsletter from a real school. And we'll take a look at what the current design is this month. Okay, so it's a year ago instead. Alright, so a few items here that need to be noted. Number one is this word art up here. It's elementary. You really want your levels of heading to make sense here. It's elementary. I'm hoping that that's the name of the monthly newsletter. You'll see that the awards program tomorrow, the text is really quite ugly. It's very blurry. It's very pixely. In terms of text types, you want it to be accessible. You want the readability to be high. Scripts usually aren't very high in terms of readability. You also want to choose the maximum 3 different fonts that you use on a page. If you go through and you count them on this page, you will find at least 7 different fonts that are being used. We don't have repetition. We have something that's bolded here, this text body here, and flows right into just regular text. Again, different fonts as well at that point. If we're trying to package it so this grabs our attention a little bit better, you probably want to package it up a different way so it does grab attention. You want to separate it out from the rest of the text so there's a reason to it. Subheadings are great. You can do subheadings. Congratulations too. And then we've bolded all the kids' names because we feel the kids are more important than the headings that are all uppercase and screaming at us. If you text individuals on a cell phone these days, all caps, or an email, all caps means you're yelling. So be careful of the message that you're giving here. Again, because the names aren't all lined up in terms of alignment, Cody Spirala, he's flowing over 2 lines. Poor kid, because he's going to have to go through to try to figure out where his name is, rather than just having it all lined up. The shadow effect doesn't lead towards accessibility. It's hard to read because the shadow is there. You have to be very careful, again, of individuals with visual impairments that are going to be reading material, and that obstruction, that obscuring of the text isn't going to help them. Okay, so we have some visuals on this page. We have some pictures. So this picture relates to this material down the bottom, right below it. The 5th grade QPC field trip to Indiana. Well, that's it. The image is there. And we have these text things that are flowing around them. And we don't know what QPC means. So that's inaccessible to people trying to figure out what this school actually does. And there's no write-up of the actual event. So we don't know what it really does. Again, we have clip art popped into different places. So, we have this clip art from the school nurse that it probably is supposed to be a pill, what the image is, but it, who knows what it is. It looks like a marshmallow on a stick or something. So it's hard to decode what that image is. Again, if you're going to use images, they have to really make sense, and you use them placement-wise to show a message. Again, this is just a decorative visual because it's a fishing derby. So, okay, it makes sense. Have a relaxing summer break. See you next year. So we have, our attempt at diversity here using this image, and kids doing different things, I guess, in the summer. We have the month of May, so somebody's decided to put happy flowers in. Again, you've got to be careful with what you're using visually to make sure that it lines up and makes sense. Not happenstance, just occurs. Okay, so that concludes your first few lectures, honestly, including visual communication, visual literacy. At this point, you're going to want to review, again, my PowerPoint slides. So you see the written material that's there in the notes field underneath the individual slides. And then you can go and take a crack at the visual literacy quiz. See you in the next Flash lecture.